What if everything you thought you knew about power in the Middle East collapsed in a single night? Not gradually, not through years of slow change, but in a matter of hours, written across the sky in fire and silence. Because what just happened was not a routine military exchange, and it wasn't just another escalation in a long-running conflict. It was something far more decisive. It was a message delivered with precision, scale, and timing that forced governments, analysts, and military planners around the world to rethink assumptions that had held firm for decades. When the first missiles launched in the early hours, the global system was still operating under old rules. By the time the final trails disappeared from the horizon, those rules were no longer valid. A coordinated wave of nearly 300 missiles and kamikaze drones moved with a level of organization and technical execution that many Western experts had previously dismissed as beyond Iran's current capabilities. This was not symbolic, it was calculated. Every target was chosen with a cold, deliberate understanding of how to weaken not just infrastructure, but the logic behind Israel's entire military posture. At the center of this strike was Nevatim Air Base, a facility that represents far more than just another military installation. This is where Israel's F-35I fleet operates over 55th generation stealth fighters that form the backbone of its air superiority. These aircraft are not defensive tools. They are designed for offensive dominance, built to enter hostile airspace, strike critical targets with precision, and return without being detected. Israel's long-range strike capability, including any serious plan targeting Iranian infrastructure, depends heavily on this base. So when Nevatim was hit, the damage wasn't just physical. It struck directly at Israel's ability to project power beyond its borders. Thick columns of smoke rising into the morning sky, visible from kilometers away, told only part of the story. What mattered more was what those impacts represented a direct challenge to the very foundation of Israel's military strategy. But the deeper shock came from something even more significant. The system that Israel and its allies had long presented as nearly impenetrable, the Iron Dome, did not perform as expected. For years, it had been marketed as a technological shield, capable of protecting civilian areas from virtually any aerial threat. Billions of dollars had gone into its development, backed heavily by American funding and political support. Yet on this night, that shield didn't just show cracks, it was overwhelmed. Out of approximately 300 incoming targets, fewer than 200 were intercepted. Around 100 reached their intended destinations. And those numbers are not just statistics. They represent a structural failure that will force a complete reassessment of defensive doctrine. Because once a system designed to ensure security shows this level of vulnerability under pressure, confidence in it does not simply return overnight. Then came a moment that changed the meaning of the entire event. While the strike was still unfolding, something unexpected was happening far from the immediate battlefield. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, along with its supporting vessels, began quietly increasing its distance from the Gulf of Oman. There was no announcement, no public explanation, just movement. The most powerful naval force on Earth, designed to project dominance and deter threats, was repositioning away from the center of escalation rather than toward it. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was a signal that even the most advanced military systems operate within limits, and that those limits had just been tested in real time. So, what actually happened here? How did a country long described as technologically constrained manage to execute such a complex, coordinated operation against one of the most advanced defense networks in the world? And what does it mean when the systems designed to prevent exactly this scenario fail to hold under pressure? These are the questions that matter, and they're the ones we're going to break down. But before we go deeper, take a moment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. This space is built for analysis that goes beyond headlines into the real mechanics of power, strategy, and decision-making. If you want clarity instead of noise, you're in the right place. Now let's move forward, because what comes next will reshape how you understand not just this event, but the entire region. To understand the scale of what happened, you need to look at Nevatim not as a location, but as a strategic asset. Within Israel's military doctrine, it is one of the most critical nodes. The F-35I fleet stationed there represents a technological advantage that Israel has relied on to maintain superiority over its adversaries. These aircraft allow for precision strikes deep inside enemy territory while minimizing exposure. Remove or weaken that capability, and the balance shifts immediately. That is why the choice of target was not random. It was deliberate. This was not about sending a message, it was about changing the equation. And that leads to another critical point: the level of intelligence required to carry out such an operation. Striking a facility like Nevatim with this level of accuracy suggests years of preparation, surveillance, data collection, analysis. This was not improvised. It reflects a sustained effort to map vulnerabilities, understand defense patterns, and identify exactly where pressure would be most effective. The failure to detect or disrupt this preparation in time raises serious questions for both Israeli and allied intelligence systems. Because in modern warfare, what you don't see coming often matters more than what you can defend against once it arrives. The structure of the attack itself reveals even more. It was not a single wave, but a layered operation designed to overload and exploit. The first phase involved a swarm of low-cost drones acting as decoys. These were not meant to cause destruction. Their role was strategic to trigger defensive systems, force interceptors to engage, and push radar and control systems toward their operational limits. When hundreds of signals appear simultaneously, even advanced systems face strain. Decision-making slows, prioritization becomes less accurate, and gaps begin to form. And those gaps are not accidental, they are predictable under saturation conditions. Into those gaps came the second wave: precision-guided ballistic missiles, each assigned specific coordinates, targeting hardened infrastructure. These were not random strikes. They were aimed at hangars, fuel depots, communication systems, components essential to maintaining operational capability. And unlike older systems, these missiles adjusted in their final phase, making interception significantly more difficult. The combination of saturation followed by precision is not new in theory, but executing it at this scale and effectiveness marks a significant step forward in capability. The immediate aftermath was captured not by official sources, but by civilians. Videos began circulating within minutes, showing multiple impacts, secondary explosions, and fires spreading across the base. These were not isolated hits. They indicated deeper damage potentially to munitions, storage, and critical infrastructure, and the initial response from Israeli authorities was telling: silence. In a system where communication is tightly controlled, silence often signals the seriousness of an event. When official statements did arrive, they confirmed impacts but avoided specifics, leaving key details unanswered. And it didn't stop at Nevatim. The strike extended to radar systems, power distribution networks, and intelligence infrastructure. Each target was selected to reduce situational awareness and complicate response efforts. When early warning systems are degraded, reaction times increase. When power systems are disrupted, coordination becomes more difficult. When intelligence networks are affected, the ability to track and respond to further threats is weakened. This was not just an attack, it was a coordinated attempt to disrupt an entire defensive ecosystem. The conclusion that many analysts are already reaching is difficult to ignore. This was not the action of a force limited by sanctions or technological isolation. It was a result of long-term preparation, strategic planning, and a clear understanding of both strengths and weaknesses on both sides. And if that assessment is accurate, then what happened here is not just significant for one night. It changes how future conflicts in the region will be approached, planned, and executed. To understand how something like this became possible, you have to go back years, decades, in fact, to a decision that didn't look dramatic at the time, but ended up shaping everything that followed. Instead of treating sanctions as a limitation, Iran treated them as a challenge. Every restriction became a problem to solve. Every blocked supply chain forced engineers to build alternatives from scratch. And over time, that approach didn't just compensate for isolation, it created a system that no longer depended on external approval or access. What we saw in this strike was not a sudden leap forward. It was the visible outcome of years of internal development where necessity drove innovation at every level of the defense industry. The primary weapon used in this operation, the Kebar Shekan translated as Fortress Breaker, is a clear example of that evolution. This is not a modified version of older systems. It belongs to a newer generation of missile design, representing a significant jump from the earlier technologies Iran relied on in the late 20th century. The difference is not incremental, it's foundational. The guidance system alone shows how far things have progressed. Instead of relying solely on basic navigation, it integrates multiple layers, inertial systems, terrain referencing, and in the final phase, independent targeting using onboard sensors. That last part is critical. It means the missile does not depend on external signals like GPS, which can be jammed or disrupted. Even when electronic interference is attempted, the system continues operating with its own internal logic. And on this night, attempts to interfere with guidance had no measurable effect on accuracy. But the real challenge for defensive systems comes in the final moments before impact. Traditional ballistic trajectories are predictable. Defensive interceptors calculate where the incoming object will be and attempt to meet it at that point. But the K-bar-Shakhan changes that equation. In its terminal phase, it doesn't follow a simple arc. It maneuvers shifting direction at extremely high speeds, altering its approach in ways that disrupt prediction algorithms. For a defensive missile to intercept successfully, it must anticipate where the target will be, not where it is. And when the target itself changes course unpredictably, that calculation becomes unreliable. This is not just a technical improvement. It's a direct response to the logic behind modern missile defense systems. And based on what we saw, that response worked. Alongside these ballistic systems, another component played a crucial role: the Shahed series of loitering munitions. These drones have been discussed before in other conflicts, but what appeared in this operation showed clear signs of advancement. They weren't just flying toward targets, they were adapting. Their navigation systems appeared upgraded, allowing them to adjust routes mid-flight, respond to the environment, and approach from angles that reduce their visibility to radar systems. By flying at lower altitudes and using terrain to mask their movement, they entered zones where many defense systems are less effective. In simple terms, they didn't just move, they maneuvered intelligently within the battlefield environment. And this brings us to something often overlooked in discussions like this: cost. Not just the cost of building weapons, but the cost of defending against them. Because this is where the strategic balance starts to shift in a very practical way. A K-bar-Shakhan missile is estimated to cost between $500,000 and under $1 million to produce. On the other side, intercepting a single incoming threat often requires multiple defensive missiles. For systems like Iron Dome, engaging a target reliably means firing 2 interceptors, each costing tens of thousands of dollars. But when dealing with more advanced threats that require higher-tier systems like David Sling or Arrow, the cost per interceptor rises dramatically into the millions. Now scale that up. Hundreds of incoming targets, each requiring engagement. The defending side is forced to spend significantly more resources just to prevent damage, while the attacking side spends far less to create that pressure. Over time, this imbalance becomes unsustainable. It's not about winning a single exchange, it's about maintaining the ability to continue responding. If the cost of defense consistently exceeds the cost of attack, the system begins to strain. Stockpiles run low, production cycles lag behind demand, and even with external support, replenishment takes time. This is what military planners refer to as an economic pressure strategy. The objective is not immediate victory, but gradual exhaustion. Force the defender to spend more, react faster, and operate under increasing strain. And when that pressure is applied consistently, cracks begin to appear not just in equipment, but in planning and decision-making. The events of this night suggest that this strategy is not theoretical. It's operational. Another factor that cannot be ignored is self-sufficiency. The weapons used in this strike were not assembled from imported components. They were designed, built, and deployed within a domestic framework. That matters, because it removes external variables. There is no reliance on foreign suppliers, no dependency on political approval, no vulnerability to supply chain disruption. When a system is built internally, it can be scaled, modified, and deployed without waiting for outside support. And in a conflict environment, that flexibility becomes a major advantage. For years, the assumption behind sanctions was straightforward: limit access to technology, and capability will decline. But what we're seeing challenges that assumption directly. Instead of slowing development, isolation appears to have redirected it inward, creating a different kind of capability, one that is less visible, but potentially more resilient. The systems used in this operation did not rely on external approval. They functioned independently, and they performed under pressure. And this brings us back to the broader picture. Because what we're looking at is not just a set of weapons, but a system, a combination of technology, strategy, and production that works together. Each component supports the others. Drones create saturation. Missiles exploit the gaps. Cost dynamics apply long-term pressure. And self-sufficiency ensures continuity. When all of these elements align, the result is not just effectiveness, it's sustainability. Which leads to a critical question. If this level of coordination and capability is now operational, how does that change the way future conflicts are approached? Because once a system proves it can function at this scale, it becomes part of the baseline for planning on all sides. Defensive systems will need to adapt. Strategies will need to evolve. And assumptions that once seemed stable will need to be reconsidered. But while all of this was unfolding in the air, something equally important was happening at sea. A shift that didn't involve explosions or direct confrontation, but may carry just as much weight in terms of long-term impact. Because power is not only about what you do, it's also about where you choose to be and where you choose not to be.